The evolution of the textbook in education. Textbooks designed for education started with the ancient Greeks. However, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word textbook did not have its modern meaning until the end of the 18th century, when such books were commonly in the hands of teachers and students. Defined as a book used as a standard work for the study of a particular subject, now usually one written specifically for this purpose, a manual of instruction in any science or branch of study, especially a work recognized as an authority, the textbook distinguished itself from other books used for teaching and learning purposes that weren't necessarily intended for educational purposes by their authors and publishers. During the 18th and 19th century, informal education within the family home made its transformation into formal schooling within a school setting. The invention of the printing press and compulsory schooling increased the printing of standardized textbooks. Textbooks were specifically designed to offer a pedagogical presentation of a certain field of knowledge and became the primary teaching tool in school settings. To understand how the textbook became a cornerstone of education, it is important to examine the socio-cultural context that it evolved in. What was happening in the broader society that influenced the contents of textbooks and their use in mass education? Religion to morality. In 1690, the New England Primer was the first textbook published in America for use by all schools. It was rooted in the belief that Christianity be central in a person's life. Man's fall into sin caused our current state of decay, and it was only by doing God's will that children could avoid the death of the wicked. Christ's salvation delivered them not only from sin and death, but also from ignorance and from the calamities of life. Enter the New England Primer textbook that saved children from eternal damnation while also providing instruction in literacy. The primer included prayers, a catechism with 107 questions and answers about faith, vocabulary words, and alphabet activities. By the 19th century, religious values and the contents of textbooks slowly gave way to more general moral values. The transition reflected a societal shift that was influenced by the social gospel movement. The basic beliefs and doctrines of Christianity became less relevant. Instead, Christian ethics were applied to solving social problems. The development of moral living became the focus to improve the moral and social conditions of society. Religion was becoming replaced by moralism. The alphabet rhymes and illustrations of the New England Primer that was mentioned before transformed in content through numerous subsequent editions until by the 19th century they became completely secular. A series of books called the McGuffey Readers were also published in America during this time and were designed to teach children how to read through educating them about morality through character development. For example, the child model in the first book was prompt, good, kind, honest, and truthful. A similar pattern could also be observed in Canada. Beginning in the 1840s, Egerton Ryerson had prescribed standard textbooks in Ontario that were rooted in a Protestant tradition. The Canadian series of reading books, properly known as the Red Series, were rooted in religion. In 1872, John Jessup, BC's first superintendent of education, followed Ryerson's lead and prescribed the list of textbooks used in Ontario for use in British Columbia. Jessup continued to prescribe additional textbooks rooted in religion. For example, the textbook Collier's Outlines of General History assumed a literal interpretation of the Bible and a belief in Orthodox Christian doctrines. It held that the world was created in 4004 BC and that Adam's fall into sin and the story of the Tower of Babel were all literal world history events. The textbook Lenny's Grammar was also prescribed and used heavily referenced scriptural texts in its contents. The shift from religion to morality in Canadian society was largely influenced by John Watson, whose liberal theology had a significant influence on the social gospel movement of the time. In this context, textbooks evolved from upholding the fundamentals of traditional Christian beliefs to upholding the moral law that continued into the 20th century. For example, in the 1880s, the Canadian Reader's second primer was primarily based in its moral content, with only 2 religious references being noted. The 1901 second primer contained only a picture of Samuel without an explanation. A secular wake-up song replaced the traditional morning prayers or hymns in a 1916 reader. Textbooks began to teach students moral lessons using the Golden Rule and were unambiguous between right and wrong. Students were taught moral lessons and work ethic through aphorisms. You are happy because you are good. When asked to do right, never say I don't want to. A shift in pedagogy. The 18th century was characterized by the catechetical style of learning. The teacher would read a question and the student would recite the answer, both of which were found in the text. The catechetical style released the teacher from having specialized pedagogical or subject knowledge. The textbook was the authority, and the goal for learning was memorization. During the mid-19th century, the goal for learning shifted from memorization to understanding. But why? A change in educational theory and a rise in teacher training both contributed to this shift. John Pestalozzi was a Swiss educator and social reformer who had a profound influence on education. Some of his key ideas included: people learn through their senses, first experience, then the word. People can develop their inner powers by action. They are then more likely to reach their moral state. Pestalozzi's ideas were child-centered rather than teacher-centered and focused on an active learning experience rather than a passive one. American teachers increasingly became trained in the Pestalozzian approach, also known as object teaching. Combined with the common school movement at the time, object teaching was widely taught in classrooms, and teachers trained in this approach began to join the ranks of elementary and high school textbook authors. The types of questions in textbooks began to change. After the 1840s, inductive questions became more common and eroded the dominance of catechetical questions from the past. A similar pattern can also be observed in Canada. For example, in Quebec, textbooks were being criticized for being outdated. Conceived by religious communities and publishers that belonged to these communities, these textbooks were violently condemned in the Parent Report of Quebec, which identified the poverty of textbooks in use in public schools. The Parent Commission called for all textbooks that displayed impoverished language, doubtful taste, and outmoded pedagogy to be eliminated. Heavily influenced by the current thoughts of Americans that promoted a non-directive approach to learning, the people of Quebec became informed by the child-centered pedagogy and active learning approaches of French educator René, who advocated for children as their own agents for learning through activity and experience. This began the process of years of reform between the people of Quebec and their government as they continued to challenge the textbook as an object of authority. As early as 1931, Brother Marie Victorin wrote, "Without denying the usefulness of textbooks, I wonder if we haven't exaggerated their importance. We must realize that if we're not careful, books, and textbooks in particular, soon cease to be a mirror and instead become a screen, which instead of broadening thought can easily repress it, restrain it, and lock it up in the terrible prison house of words." In conclusion, the definition of textbooks as an object of authority is much more complex than can be explained in a 10-minute video, but I hope that the examples that I have highlighted demonstrate how the broader socio-cultural context influence the contents of the textbook to evolve and be challenged throughout different periods in history. The textbook as an object of authority has always been controversial and continues into the 21st century as we examine the need for textbooks in the digital age. What skills do we currently value in society? What are our current pedagogies about meaningful learning? Are print textbooks a mirror or a screen towards meaningful learning? How do electronic textbooks reflect what we value in our broader society? Can textbooks still even be defined as objects of authority in the 21st century? Thanks for listening.